The morning sun cast long shadows across the military academy's pristine courtyard as parents gathered for their children's graduation ceremony. Among the crowd of proud families stood Marcus Thompson, a quiet man in his early 40s wearing a simple navy blue suit. His weathered hands, scarred from years of service, adjusted his tie nervously as he scanned the sea of uniforms for his daughter Sarah. Marcus had been looking forward to this day for months. Sarah was graduating from the Naval Academy with honors, following in the footsteps of her father's military service, though she had chosen the Navy over his own path. He couldn't have been prouder. After years of single parenting following his wife's death from cancer, seeing Sarah achieve her dreams felt like the greatest victory of his life. The ceremony was being held in the Academy's grand auditorium, where hundreds of family members filled the seats. Military officials, high-ranking officers, and distinguished guests occupied the front rows. Marcus found his assigned seat in the middle section, nodding politely to the other parents around him. He noticed how some families seemed to know each other, chatting easily about their children's accomplishments and their own military backgrounds. As the ceremony began, Marcus watched with quiet pride as Sarah marched in with her class. She looked sharp in her dress uniform, her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect bun, her posture reflecting the discipline and confidence the Academy had instilled in her. When her name was called and she stepped forward to receive her commission, Marcus felt his chest swell with emotion. This was the moment they had both worked toward for 4 long years. After the official ceremony concluded, the graduates mingled with their families during a reception in the Academy's Officers Club. Marcus made his way through the crowd, accepting congratulations from other parents and watching Sarah network with her new fellow officers. She had always been social and confident, traits that would serve her well in her naval career. The reception was elegant, with white linens covering round tables and military personnel in dress uniforms serving as hosts. A small band played patriotic music, while guests enjoyed refreshments and conversation. Marcus felt slightly out of place among some of the other families, many of whom seemed more comfortable in these formal military settings. He had always been more at home in operational environments than social ones. As he stood near the refreshment table, sipping coffee and watching Sarah laugh with her classmates, Marcus overheard conversations about various military experiences. Some parents were sharing stories of their own service, while others discussed their children's future assignments. The atmosphere was warm and celebratory, filled with the pride that comes with military achievement. Admiral Richard Hawthorne made his entrance about an hour into the reception. At 62, he was an imposing figure with silver hair and a chest full of ribbons that spoke to a distinguished career in naval administration. He had spent most of his service years behind desks and in conference rooms, managing budgets and personnel rather than leading combat operations. His presence commanded attention, and a small crowd quickly gathered around him as he made his way through the reception. The Admiral was known for his sharp tongue and his tendency to establish dominance in social situations. He had a reputation for testing people, particularly those he perceived as beneath his rank or station. Some called it hazing, others called it leadership style, but everyone agreed that Admiral Hawthorne enjoyed putting people in their place. As he moved through the crowd, shaking hands and making small talk with the families, his eyes fell on Marcus, standing quietly by himself near the back of the room. Something about the man's demeanor, his obvious discomfort in the social setting, seemed to catch the Admiral's attention. Marcus wasn't networking or boasting about his daughter's achievements like many of the other parents. He simply stood there, content to observe and stay out of the way. Admiral Hawthorne excused himself from his current conversation and began making his way toward Marcus. Several other guests noticed the Admiral's movement and followed his path with curious eyes. There was something about his purposeful stride that suggested this wasn't going to be a casual introduction. Marcus noticed the Admiral approaching but didn't think much of it at first. He assumed the man was simply making rounds, greeting parents as part of his official duties. Marcus straightened his posture slightly and prepared to shake hands and exchange pleasantries, the way he had with other officers throughout the afternoon. The Admiral stopped directly in front of Marcus, his eyes scanning the man from head to toe with obvious assessment. Marcus was tall but lean, his build suggesting someone who stayed in shape without the bulk that came from gym workouts. His hands were calloused, his face weathered in a way that spoke to time spent outdoors in harsh conditions. There was something about his bearing, even in civilian clothes, that suggested military training. Several other reception guests had begun to gather nearby, sensing that some kind of interaction was about to take place. The conversations around them grew quieter as people turned their attention to the Admiral and the quiet man in the Navy suit. Sarah, who had been chatting with classmates across the room, noticed the gathering crowd and began moving in their direction. Admiral Hawthorne extended his hand in greeting, and Marcus shook it with a firm grip that didn't go unnoticed. The Admiral's eyes narrowed slightly as he felt the strength and controlled nature of Marcus's handshake. It was the grip of someone accustomed to physical demands and precise control. The Admiral began with standard pleasantries, asking about Marcus's daughter and her academic achievements. Marcus responded politely, sharing his pride in Sarah's accomplishments and her plans for her naval career. The conversation seemed normal at first, the kind of exchange happening throughout the reception between officials and proud parents. But as they talked, Admiral Hawthorne began to probe deeper. He asked about Marcus's own background, his profession, his connection to the military. Marcus answered honestly but briefly, explaining that he had served in the military himself before transitioning to civilian work. He didn't elaborate on the details of his service, preferring to keep the focus on Sarah and her achievements. The Admiral's questions became more pointed. He wanted to know which branch Marcus had served in, what his role had been, how long he had been in the service. Marcus answered each question politely, but without the detailed responses the Admiral seemed to be fishing for. This restraint only seemed to encourage the Admiral's probing. Marcus could sense that this was turning into something more than casual conversation. He recognized the interrogation technique, the way the Admiral was trying to establish hierarchy and control. Marcus had encountered similar personalities during his own service, officers who used rank and position to intimidate others. He remained calm and respectful, but internally he was preparing for whatever direction this conversation might take. The crowd around them had grown larger, with more reception guests stopping their own conversations to listen. Sarah had made her way to the edge of the group, close enough to hear what was happening but not yet close enough to intervene. She could see the tension building in her father's posture, subtle signs that others might miss but that she had learned to read over the years. Admiral Hawthorne seemed to sense Marcus's reluctance to elaborate on his military service, and this appeared to irritate him. He was accustomed to people being eager to discuss their military backgrounds, especially in this kind of setting. Marcus's quiet reserve challenged the Admiral's expectations and his need to establish dominance in the conversation. The Admiral's voice took on a slightly sharper edge as he continued his questioning. He made comments about how important it was for parents to understand the military culture their children were entering, how civilian perspectives sometimes failed to grasp the realities of military service. His words carried subtle implications about Marcus's fitness to understand his daughter's career choice. Marcus remained calm and respectful, but those who knew him well would have recognized the slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in his stance. These were signs that Marcus was moving from social politeness to operational awareness, his training beginning to assert itself, despite the civilian setting. The Admiral seemed to interpret Marcus's continued restraint as weakness or intimidation. This encouraged him to press harder, to find the breaking point that would establish his dominance in front of the watching crowd. He began making more direct challenges, questioning whether Marcus truly understood what military service entailed, whether he had ever faced real danger or made real sacrifices. Sarah, watching from the edge of the crowd, felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. She knew her father's history, understood the depth of his service, and the price he had paid for it. She also knew that he would never volunteer that information in a social setting, especially not to defend himself against someone trying to provoke him. Marcus had always taught her that actions spoke louder than words, and that true strength didn't need to announce itself. The tension in the immediate area was becoming palpable. Other reception guests were beginning to feel uncomfortable with the Admiral's increasingly aggressive questioning. Some were starting to look away, while others watched with the fascination that comes with witnessing a potential confrontation. The celebratory atmosphere of the reception was being replaced by an undercurrent of unease. Marcus continued to respond to the Admiral's questions and comments with polite restraint, but his answers were becoming shorter, more clipped. He was clearly trying to de-escalate the situation while maintaining his dignity and respect for the setting. This was his daughter's day, and he had no intention of creating a scene that might overshadow her achievement. but Admiral Hawthorne seemed determined to push until he found Marcus's breaking point. His comments became more personal, more directly challenging. He questioned whether Marcus had ever really served in combat, whether he had ever faced real adversity, whether he had the kind of experience that would help him understand what his daughter might face in her military career. The Admiral's voice carried across the immediate area, drawing even more attention from other reception guests. Some of the Academy staff were beginning to notice the gathering crowd and the increasingly uncomfortable atmosphere. Several people were starting to move away from the confrontation, while others seemed drawn to watch what might happen next. Marcus could feel the weight of all the attention focused on him and the Admiral. He was acutely aware that Sarah was watching, that her classmates and new colleagues were observing this interaction. He knew that how he handled this situation could potentially affect Sarah's reputation and her relationships with her fellow officers. This knowledge only strengthened his resolve to remain calm and professional. The Admiral, perhaps sensing that his direct challenges weren't having the desired effect, decided to try a different approach. His tone shifted slightly, taking on what might have seemed like casual curiosity to someone who didn't recognize the tactic. But Marcus immediately identified it as another form of interrogation technique, designed to catch him off guard or make him reveal information he hadn't intended to share. The Admiral began asking about specific aspects of military service, using terminology and references that would be familiar to someone with genuine experience but might confuse or intimidate a civilian pretending to have military background. It was a test, designed to either expose Marcus as a fraud or force him to reveal more about his actual service than he was comfortable sharing in this setting. Marcus recognized every technique the Admiral was using, understood the purpose behind each question and comment. His own training had included similar psychological tactics, though his had been designed for much more serious purposes than social dominance games. He found himself analyzing the Admiral's approach with professional detachment, even as he maintained his polite exterior. The Admiral's questions became increasingly specific and technical. He asked about weapon systems, tactical procedures, and operational terminology that would trip up someone with limited military experience. Marcus answered each question accurately, but without elaboration, his responses precise and professional. This only seemed to frustrate the Admiral further, as he wasn't getting the reaction he expected. Several minutes passed with this verbal sparring, the Admiral probing and Marcus deflecting with quiet competence. The crowd around them had grown to include nearly half the reception guests, all drawn by the unusual confrontation taking place at what should have been a celebration. Some of the Academy instructors were beginning to look concerned, recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond normal social interaction. Admiral Hawthorne's frustration was becoming more evident. He had expected either to intimidate Marcus into backing down or to expose him as someone pretending to have military experience. Instead, he was facing someone who clearly knew what he was talking about, but refused to be drawn into the kind of detailed discussion that would satisfy the Admiral's need for dominance. The Admiral decided to escalate his approach. His voice took on a more condescending tone as he began making assumptions about Marcus's service. He suggested that Marcus had probably served in some support role, perhaps supply or administration, something that would give him familiarity with military terminology without exposing him to real danger or responsibility. The implication was clear. Marcus might have worn a uniform, but he wasn't a real warrior. This line of attack drew uncomfortable murmurs from some of the watching crowd. Even those who didn't know Marcus personally could see that the Admiral was crossing lines of basic courtesy and respect. Several people began looking around for Academy officials who might intervene, while others started to drift away from the confrontation, uncomfortable with witnessing what felt like bullying. Marcus's response to these more direct insults remained measured and polite, but close observers could see subtle changes in his demeanor. His stillness became more complete, his attention more focused. These were signs that someone with his training was shifting from social mode to tactical awareness, even though the threat was only verbal and social rather than physical. Sarah had moved closer to the confrontation, her face showing concern and growing anger at how her father was being treated. She knew the truth about his service, understood the depth of his experience, and the sacrifices he had made. Watching him be disrespected by someone who had never faced real combat was becoming increasingly difficult for her to tolerate. The Admiral, encouraged by what he interpreted as continued passivity from Marcus, decided to make his challenge more direct and public. He raised his voice slightly, ensuring that everyone in the immediate area could hear clearly. His words were calculated to humiliate Marcus in front of the crowd and establish the Admiral's own superiority. Admiral Hawthorne began talking about the difference between real military service and what he called playing soldier. He spoke about the distinction between those who had faced genuine combat situations and those who had simply gone through training exercises. His implications about Marcus's service became more insulting and direct, designed to provoke a reaction that would justify further escalation. The atmosphere in the room had become increasingly tense. Conversations at other tables had stopped as people turned their attention to the confrontation. Some of the academy staff were beginning to move in their direction, recognizing that the situation needed to be diffused before it escalated further, but they were still several minutes away from reaching the group. Marcus could feel the weight of everyone's attention, could sense the discomfort and anticipation in the crowd around them. He was acutely aware that this moment could define not just his own reputation, but potentially affect Sarah's standing with her new colleagues and superiors. The knowledge that his daughter's future might be impacted by this confrontation only strengthened his resolve to handle it with dignity and restraint. But Admiral Hawthorne wasn't finished. Having failed to provoke the reaction he wanted through direct insults and implications, he decided to try a different approach. His tone shifted again, becoming almost playful, as if he were about to share a joke with the crowd. But Marcus recognized this tactic as well, understanding that the Admiral was setting up for what would likely be his most aggressive challenge yet. The Admiral began talking about military call signs, explaining to the crowd how special operations personnel and combat pilots received nicknames that reflected their personalities, abilities, or memorable moments in their careers. He spoke with the authority of someone lecturing to an audience that he assumed knew less than he did about military culture and traditions. As he talked about call signs, the Admiral's eyes never left Marcus's face, watching for any reaction or sign of recognition. He was building up to something, setting the stage for what he clearly intended to be the culmination of his verbal assault. The crowd sensed this as well, the tension in the room becoming almost palpable as everyone waited to see where this was leading. Admiral Hawthorne explained how call signs were earned through actual service, through facing real danger and proving oneself under fire. He emphasized that these weren't just nicknames, but symbols of respect and recognition that could only be earned through genuine military achievement. His implication was clear. Someone like Marcus, who he assumed had never seen real combat, would never have earned such recognition. The Admiral's voice took on a mocking tone as he turned his full attention back to Marcus. He suggested that since Marcus seemed reluctant to discuss the details of his service, perhaps they should approach it differently. Instead of asking about his actual experiences, why not ask about his call sign? Surely someone who had really served in a significant capacity would have earned a call sign. The question hung in the air like a challenge, the Admiral's tone making it clear that he expected Marcus either to admit he had never earned a call sign or to make something up that the Admiral could then expose as a lie. It was meant to be the final humiliation, the moment when Marcus would be revealed as someone pretending to a military background he had never really earned. The crowd around them fell silent, sensing that this was the climactic moment of the confrontation. Sarah's face had gone pale, her hands clenched at her sides as she watched her father being publicly humiliated by someone who had no idea who he really was or what he had accomplished. She wanted to intervene, to defend her father, but she also knew that doing so might make things worse for both of them. Marcus stood quietly for a long moment, his face expressionless as he considered his response. The Admiral waited with obvious satisfaction, confident that he had finally found the question that would expose Marcus's pretensions and establish his own dominance in front of the watching crowd. The silence stretched on, building tension and anticipation. Several people in the crowd began to shift uncomfortably, sensing that they were witnessing something that was about to cross from uncomfortable to genuinely ugly. Some of the Academy staff had noticed the situation and were beginning to move in their direction, but they were still too far away to intervene effectively. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear enough for everyone in the immediate area to hear. His tone was calm and measured, showing none of the emotion that the Admiral had been trying to provoke. He looked directly at Admiral Hawthorne as he delivered his response, his gaze steady and unflinching. Marcus acknowledged that he had indeed earned a call sign during his military service. He said this simply, without elaboration or boasting, as if he were stating a basic fact. The Admiral's eyes lit up with anticipation, Sensing that he was about to spring his trap and expose Marcus as either a liar or someone with an inflated sense of his own importance, the Admiral's response was immediate and mocking. He asked, with obvious sarcasm, what call sign someone like Marcus could possibly have earned. His tone suggested that he expected to hear something ridiculous or obviously made up, something that would provide the perfect opportunity to humiliate Marcus in front of the entire gathering. Marcus paused again, his expression remaining calm and neutral. When he answered, his voice carried no pride or boasting, no attempt to impress or intimidate. He simply stated his call sign as he had stated everything else, as a basic fact that required no embellishment or explanation. The two words he spoke seemed to hang in the air for a moment, their significance not immediately apparent to most of the watching crowd, but Admiral Hawthorne's reaction was instantaneous and unmistakable. The mocking smile vanished from his face, replaced by a look of shock that quickly transformed into something approaching fear. The Admiral's face went pale, his confident posture crumbling as the implications of what he had just heard began to sink in. His mouth opened slightly as if he were about to speak, but no words came out. For the first time in the entire confrontation, Admiral Hawthorne appeared to be at a complete loss for words. The crowd around them sensed that something significant had just happened, though most didn't understand exactly what. The Admiral's dramatic change in demeanor was obvious to everyone, his transformation from confident aggressor to shocked silence happening in the space of a few seconds. People began looking at each other with confusion, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Sarah's expression had changed as well, from anxiety to something approaching pride and satisfaction. She knew exactly what her father's call sign meant, understood the significance of what he had just revealed to the Admiral. Her concern for her father was being replaced by anticipation of what would happen next. Admiral Hawthorne seemed to be struggling to process what he had just heard. His knowledge of military history and special operations was extensive enough for him to understand the implications of Marcus's call sign, to recognize what it meant about his service and his capabilities. The Admiral realized that he had just spent the better part of an hour insulting and attempting to humiliate someone whose military record far exceeded his own. The Admiral's hands began to shake slightly as the full weight of his mistake became clear to him. He had used his rank and position to bully someone he assumed was beneath him, only to discover that he had been challenging someone whose service record was legendary within certain circles of the military community. The embarrassment and fear in his eyes were becoming increasingly obvious to the watching crowd. Marcus remained perfectly still, his expression unchanged, watching the Admiral's reaction with the same calm attention he had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. He didn't gloat or show satisfaction at the Admiral's obvious distress. He simply waited, giving the man time to fully comprehend the situation he had created for himself. The silence stretched on, becoming increasingly uncomfortable for everyone present. The Admiral seemed frozen, unable to speak or move, his earlier confidence completely shattered by the revelation of who he had really been challenging. The crowd began to murmur among themselves, trying to understand what was happening and why the Admiral had reacted so dramatically. Several Academy officials had finally reached the edge of the crowd and were beginning to push through, recognizing that some kind of significant incident was taking place. But they arrived to find not the heated confrontation they had expected, but a strange tableau of frozen silence, with Admiral Hawthorne standing motionless and apparently speechless in front of the quiet man in the Navy suit. The call sign Iron Ghost carried weight in certain military circles that Admiral Hawthorne understood all too well. It belonged to a legend, someone whose exploits had been whispered about in briefing rooms and officer clubs for years. The Admiral knew the stories, had heard the classified reports, understood exactly what that call sign represented in terms of operational success and personal sacrifice. Iron Ghost was the call sign of a Navy SEAL who had served in some of the most dangerous and classified operations of the past 2 decades. The man behind that call sign had led countless missions deep behind enemy lines, had saved the lives of dozens of captured soldiers and civilians, and had accumulated a service record that would never be fully made public due to national security concerns. Admiral Hawthorne's mind raced as he tried to reconcile the quiet, unassuming man standing before him with the legendary figure whose exploits he had read about in classified briefings. The disconnect was almost impossible to process. The man he had been mocking and attempting to humiliate for the past hour was someone whose service record made the Admiral's own career look like a footnote. The Admiral had spent most of his career in administrative roles, managing personnel and resources from behind desks in safe locations. His ribbons and decorations reflected years of competent service, but nothing that approached the level of personal risk and sacrifice represented by the call sign Iron Ghost. The realization of this disparity was crushing to his ego and his sense of professional identity. Stories about Iron Ghost had circulated through military intelligence circles for years, though most were classified and could never be publicly confirmed. There were whispers of single-handed rescues of captured personnel, of infiltration missions into terrorist strongholds that had seemed impossible, of operations so sensitive that they existed only in the most restricted files. The man behind these missions had become something of a legend among those with access to such information. Admiral Hawthorne remembered specific briefings where Iron Ghost's operations had been discussed, always in vague terms due to classification levels, but with obvious respect and awe from the briefing officers. The Admiral had never expected to meet the man behind the call sign, and certainly never imagined he would encounter him at a Naval Academy graduation reception, dressed in civilian clothes and quietly celebrating his daughter's achievement. The Admiral's physical reaction to hearing the call sign was becoming more pronounced. His hands were visibly shaking now, and sweat had begun to form on his forehead despite the comfortable temperature in the reception hall. The confident, domineering persona he had projected throughout the confrontation had completely crumbled, replaced by obvious fear and mortification. Marcus continued to watch the Admiral's reaction with calm interest, his own expression remaining neutral and professional. He had seen similar reactions before, though usually in operational contexts rather than social situations. He understood the effect his call sign could have on people within the military community who were familiar with its significance. The crowd around them was becoming increasingly confused and concerned by the Admiral's obvious distress. People began whispering among themselves, trying to understand what had caused such a dramatic change in the situation. Some of the Academy staff who had reached the edge of the group were beginning to push forward, sensing that they needed to intervene in whatever was happening. Sarah had moved closer to her father, her earlier anxiety now replaced by a complex mixture of pride and concern. She was proud that her father had finally revealed something about his true service record, but she was also worried about the potential consequences of this revelation. She knew her father had spent years keeping his military background private, and she understood that there were good reasons for that secrecy. One of the Academy instructors, Captain Martinez, finally pushed through the crowd to reach Marcus and the Admiral. He could see that Admiral Hawthorne was in some kind of distress, but he didn't understand what had caused it, or how to address the situation. He looked back and forth between the two men, trying to assess what had happened and what needed to be done. Captain Martinez had arrived just as the confrontation reached its climax, missing most of the verbal sparring that had led to this moment. He could see that the Admiral was clearly shaken by something, and he assumed that some kind of medical emergency might be occurring. He began to approach Admiral Hawthorne to check on his condition and offer assistance. But Admiral Hawthorne wasn't having a medical emergency. He was having a crisis of professional identity and personal shame. The weight of what he had done, the recognition of whom he had been insulting and attempting to humiliate, was crushing. He had used his rank and position to bully someone whose service record far exceeded his own, someone who had earned respect through actions rather than administrative achievement. The Admiral's military training eventually began to reassert itself, helping him to regain some measure of composure despite his emotional turmoil. He straightened his posture slightly and attempted to speak, though his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. His first words were an attempt at an apology, though they were so quiet that only Marcus and a few people standing very close could hear them. Marcus acknowledged the Admiral's attempted apology with a slight nod, but his expression remained neutral. He understood that the man was struggling with the realization of his mistake, but Marcus had been through far more difficult situations than an uncomfortable social confrontation. His primary concern remained ensuring that this incident didn't negatively impact Sarah's career or standing with her fellow officers. The appearance of Captain Martinez and other Academy staff provided an opportunity to begin diffusing the situation. Marcus quietly suggested that perhaps Admiral Hawthorne needed some air or a place to sit down, giving the man a graceful way to exit the confrontation without losing face entirely. It was an act of mercy that the Admiral was in no position to refuse. Captain Martinez, still not understanding exactly what had transpired, was grateful for Marcus's suggestion and began helping Admiral Hawthorne toward a quieter area of the reception hall. The Admiral went with him willingly, clearly needing time to process what had happened and to figure out how to handle the aftermath of his mistake. As the Admiral was led away, the crowd that had gathered began to disperse, though many people continued to glance back at Marcus with new curiosity and respect. The word Iron Ghost had been heard by several people close enough to catch Marcus's quiet response, and some of them recognized its significance. These individuals looked at Marcus with obvious awe, understanding that they were in the presence of someone whose service record was legendary. Sarah approached her father as the crowd thinned, her face showing a mixture of emotions. She was proud of how he had handled the situation, maintaining his dignity and composure even when being publicly insulted and humiliated. But she was also concerned about the potential consequences of revealing his call sign, and worried about how this incident might affect both of their futures. Marcus put his arm around his daughter's shoulders and spoke to her quietly, reassuring her that everything would be fine. He explained that sometimes people needed to learn lessons about respect and humility, and that Admiral Hawthorne had just received one of those lessons. He emphasized that Sarah should not worry about any impact on her own career, as she had done nothing wrong and had earned her position through her own merit and hard work. The reception continued around them, though the atmosphere had changed significantly. The incident had created ripples throughout the gathering, with people discussing what they had witnessed and trying to understand its significance. Those who recognized the call sign Iron Ghost began sharing whispered explanations with others, gradually spreading awareness of Marcus's true background through the room. Word of the confrontation and its resolution began to reach other parts of the reception, including some of the Academy's senior leadership. These officials understood immediately the significance of what had occurred and began taking steps to ensure that there would be no negative consequences for either Marcus or Sarah. They also began considering what actions might be appropriate regarding Admiral Hawthorne's behavior. As the evening progressed, several people approached Marcus to introduce themselves and express their respect for his service. These were individuals who understood the significance of his call sign and wanted to acknowledge his contributions to military operations. Marcus accepted these gestures graciously, but continued to deflect attempts to discuss the details of his service record. The Academy's superintendent, Vice Admiral Patricia Collins, made her way across the reception to personally meet Marcus and Sarah. She had been briefed on what had occurred and wanted to ensure that both father and daughter understood that the incident would not reflect negatively on Sarah's standing or future assignments. She also wanted to personally apologize for Admiral Hawthorne's behavior and to express the Academy's respect for Marcus's service. Vice Admiral Collins' approach to Marcus was markedly different from Admiral Hawthorne's earlier confrontation. She greeted him with obvious respect and spoke to him as an equal, acknowledging his service without prying into classified details. Her professional demeanor and genuine appreciation for his contributions stood in stark contrast to the Admiral's earlier bullying tactics. The conversation with Vice Admiral Collins helped to officially close the incident, providing Marcus and Sarah with assurance that there would be no lasting negative consequences. The superintendent made it clear that Admiral Hawthorne's behavior was not representative of the Academy's values or standards, and that appropriate action would be taken to address his conduct. As the reception began to wind down, Marcus and Sarah found themselves surrounded by Sarah's classmates and their families, many of whom wanted to meet the man behind the legendary call sign. Marcus handled these interactions with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout the evening, answering questions when appropriate, but never boasting about his achievements or criticizing Admiral Hawthorne's behavior. The incident had transformed what should have been a simple graduation reception into something much more significant. Sarah's classmates now knew that her father was not just a supportive parent, but a genuine military legend whose service record had earned him respect at the highest levels of the special operations community. This knowledge would follow her throughout her naval career, though whether as a benefit or a burden remained to be seen. Admiral Hawthorne never returned to the reception that evening. Captain Martinez later reported that the Admiral had requested to be excused due to a sudden illness, though those familiar with the situation understood the real reason for his departure. The Admiral's reputation within the military community would never fully recover from his public humiliation of someone whose service record far exceeded his own. In the days following the reception, word of the incident spread through military circles much faster than Marcus would have preferred. The story of how Iron Ghost had quietly endured public mockery before revealing his identity became the subject of conversations in officer clubs and briefing rooms around the world. The incident became a cautionary tale about making assumptions and about the importance of treating all veterans with respect, regardless of their appearance or demeanor. For Marcus, the incident was simply another reminder of why he preferred to keep his military background private. He had spent years trying to live a quiet civilian life, focusing on raising his daughter and building a new identity beyond his military service. The public revelation of his call sign at the reception had reopened a chapter of his life that he had tried to close. But as he watched Sarah begin her naval career with confidence and pride, Marcus realized that perhaps the incident had served a positive purpose. His daughter now knew that he would always be there to protect and support her, even if it meant revealing parts of his past that he would have preferred to keep private. The love and sacrifice represented by that revelation would stay with her throughout her military career and beyond. The legend of Iron Ghost had emerged from the shadows once more, not in a combat zone or classified operation, but in defense of his daughter's honor and his own dignity. It was a reminder that true strength and courage could be found in the most unexpected places, and that the most powerful weapons were often quiet dignity, professional competence, and the love of a father for his child.